afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. Today we're covering changes in overtime regulations. My name is Amanda, and Larry Grigine will be our presenter today. I know this is a topic we've been hearing a lot of questions about, so don't worry if you don't catch everything right away. We're recording the webinar, and we'll email you the video and the slides after the webinar ends. Our next webinar is on August 2nd at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, and we'll be covering how to respond to corporate data leaks. We have a lot of participants today, so I'll be keeping the conference on mute. Larry will pause for questions periodically, and I'll unmute so that you can ask them, or if you prefer, you can type them in the question box below, and I'll ask the questions for you. Other than that, please enjoy your webinar.
Thank you very much, Amanda. I appreciate it. What I'm going to try to do is go through the changes in the new regulations. There's been a lot of press about this. The changes are substantial, but I will try to hone in on those changes that are extremely important. Now, basically what this affects is the white-collar exception under the overtime rules, and I'll explain what that is in the next few minutes. And the biggest effect of this is, first of all, is the income levels have been substantially increased in order for someone to be considered to be an exempt. And I'll go through all the different requirements for this exemption, what they are. So what this seminar will do is that I will explain what the changes are. I will overall explain these overtime rules and what's exempt and non-exempt. Please remember these changes are effective as of December 1st, 2016, so they're not effective for a few months yet, so you can plan exactly what to do. The most important thing you can do between now and then is, first of all, see which employees are going to be affected. And certain industries and certain employers will be affected more than others. And then what you basically have to do is identify those employees that are affected. You have to make a decision. You have to make a decision in this situation is, do you raise their pay? Do you cut their hours? Do you reclassify these employees as an hourly employee? And what the regulations are very clear on is the fact that you as an employer don't have to force employees to clock in and clock out. You just have to, again, if you identify an employee as being subject to these requirements and are no longer exempt, then you basically have to do is keep track of their hours. So I will go through all of that. Now, what's important in all this is the effect on benefits. Because you have to look at your 401k plan. You have to look at the definition of comp to see if overtime is included in the definition of comp, because in that situation, if overtime is included in the definition of comp, all of a sudden someone will have an increased 401k contribution where they weren't expecting to put more in. So you have to warn employees, those employees that are going to be subject to the overtime rules, that yes, you elected to have 3% of your salary, but now do you realize that your salary now includes overtime? And because of that, instead of deferring X amount, you're going to defer X plus. Now, please remember that just because you call someone's salary doesn't mean they're going to be treated as salary for these purposes. It all depends whether you meet the requirements. So just because you call someone salary doesn't mean that employee won't be subject to the overtime rules. So it doesn't matter what you call them, it's how that situation with the employee meets the definition of that employee is now considered to be non-exempt under the new rules because of the salary changes. Then you basically have to pay them overtime even though that employee technically is going to be now being paid overtime. So you have to, again, look at their situation and see, all right, how many hours are we actually paying them for, and how is this all going to affect the situation? So let's go through this. So here in this situation, there So under the Fair Labor Act, there are exemptions to these rules. In May 2014, the President issued a memo directing the Secretary of the Treasury to modernize and streamline the rules, so that's why there's changes. So under the Fair Labor Standards Act, there are exemptions, and under this, as you can see, both the DOL and IRS has released tons of new regulations. They released proposed regulations in 2015. Then they released, these regulations were released in 2016. And the reason why this is because there's been tons of lawsuits in regard to not paying of overtime. And the whole economy has changed in the fact that now employees were, there's independent contractors, there's people sharing jobs such as Uber. So all this is reflective of exactly what's going on. And this is the number of overtime lawsuits have been going on since 1991. If they've been increasing, employers are indicating that employers are not paying them overtime. So under this Fair Labor Standards Act, the law is very complex, they're vague, it was antiquated at the time. And because there's been political rhetoric over wages not going up, that was one of the reasons why this was looked at. There's greater awareness of rights, and these lawsuits are being, because plaintiff attorneys' fee awards are included in this. Now, under the Fair Labor Standards Act, if you're subject to these rules and are not exempt, you're assuming employer coverage and employer status, employee status, you have to be paid a minimum wage, overtime more than 40 hours, and there are exemptions from the minimum wage and overtime. Now, what's important here is that there's an obligation on behalf of the employer to record keep and make sure you count hours for those employees that are not exempt. If you are considered to be an exempt, then you don't have that worry about counting hours. Now, there is a white-collar exemption, and that's what's being affected under these new rules. And there's three different categories under this. So if you come under this exception, then you're not subject to the previous slide, minimum wage, overtime. And there's three different divisions. There's an executive exemption, administrative, professional, and then certain computer employees are not included in this. Now, also, that's just not these new regulations affected that, but just understand there's also other exemptions out of this rule. These include employees working for specified industries such as transportation, bulk, oil distribution, hospitals, seasonal businesses, and communication. Employees performing specific types of work such as commissioned retail salespersons, fisheries, taxi cab drivers, and newspaper delivery persons, casual babysitters and companions for disabled and elderly. Employees working under specified certifications such as full-time students, learners, apprentices, and disabled employees. Now, employers have to get this right in this situation, because if an employee is deemed to be not exempt, there's a liability for overtime and minimum wages. They can be paid over a 2-year period or 3 years if the violation is willful. There's also a liability for liquidated damage equal to the above amount. So in that situation, if an employer is found guilty, they could be subject to double damages. So that's why I think everybody's ears are perking up in this, because of the fact again, attorney's fees are being paid for, your liability could be 2 or 3 years, and you could be, again, subject to liquidated damages. Now, courts can reduce or eliminate liability for liquidated damages if the employer demonstrated it acted in good faith and had a reasonable grounds to believe it was not in violation. You know, I thought that individual was that really an exempt, and there was a gray area. But again, an employee can get their reasonable attorney's fees and costs. Now, please remember that, as I said in my opening remarks, just because you call someone salary doesn't mean they're exempt. It depends on their duty, it depends on their salary, it depends on all kinds of different factors. So payment on a salary basis is not the only basis for establishing someone is exempt. So please understand that. So let's look at in the exemption that was affected under these rules. Is the white-collar exemption. So here, there's 3 tests that you have to meet. Now, the primary duty rule has not been affected under the new rules. So, and I'll be going through that in the next few minutes. Also, the matter of compensation has been slightly changed, and I'll explain what that is. There has to be payment of salary, and I'll go through this. What's been affected mainly is the amount of the compensation. I'll be going through those amounts in the next few minutes. So again, the new rules don't really change the primary duty. The changes to the matter of compensation is small, but really has been changing is the amount of the compensation. Now let's first look at the first exemption, which is executives. To be considered an executive, the primary duty is managing an enterprise or a customarily recognized as department or subdivision head, customarily and regularly directing the work of at least 2 full-time employees or equivalent, and then have the authority to hire, fire, or recommend or given recommendations to give a particular weight. So what we're looking at here is, especially if you own a restaurant and people that are managers, that would fit very nicely under this definition. So again, this is just one of the tests on here. So again, you have to manage people in order to meet this exception. So again, under the first test, the primary duty, the primary main, again, it must be at least 50%. How is it determined? On the time spent on the primary duties. And again, we've talked about this, about the manager. The next exception is the administrative. Here, the performance of office, non-manual, directly related to the management or general management. This includes anyone who works in the tax, finance, accounting, auditing, budgeting, insurance, advertising, human resources. That just doesn't include production workers. And what's important here, there has to be an exercise of discretion and independent judgment in regard to matters and matters of significance. Consideration of possibilities and choice of action free of immediate supervision, high level of importance and significance and not just risk of loss, not skill and application of standards. I think what's important here, and these include insurance, claims adjusters, certain financial services workers, team leader of major projects, HR managers, and some system and analysts and computer programmers. The next exception is the professional primary duty. And this is a performance of the work related to advanced knowledge, customarily acquired by a prolonged course of specialization, consistent exercise of discretion and judgment. And under this exception, commonly exempted professionals are lawyers, teachers, accountants, pharmacists, actuaries, certified athletic trainers. Non-exempt would be licensed practical nurses, bookkeepers, cooks, paralegals, engineering technicians would not come under this exception. Now, a common exemption is for computers. The application of systems analysis techniques and procedures, design, development, documentation. And again, in this situation, they don't come under the white collar. There's a special exemption for these individuals. So this includes design, documentation, testing, creation, modification of programs, a combination of above which requires the same level of skills, but does not include repair, help desk, or something called CAD workers. Also, another exemption is outside sales, making sales, obtaining orders and contracts. And again, outside sales are not included in the white collar exception. Customarily and regularly engaged away from the employer. Again, this is a special exception that is not included in the white collar. Now, another exception is the highly compensated test, and again, this is somebody that performs office and not manual labor. Under the old rules, guaranteed a total compensation of at least $100,000, a maximum of $455 per week. And the reason why this is a special exception is this is an individual doesn't come specifically under one of the exceptions. And as this says, it customarily and regularly performs one or more exempt executive, administrative, professional employee, but doesn't include all the different duties. It does not apply to a computer exception. And under this situation, an employer may qualify as an exempt highly compensated if the employer customarily directs two or more employees, even though the employee does not meet all the other requirements of being an executive. So it doesn't come nicely under one of the other exceptions. They make a lot of money, but here you can be exempt under the old rules if you are making at least $100,000. That's the old rules. Now, Amanda, do we have any questions?
We do indeed. We have a couple of really great questions. The first one is, if we have multiple employees with the same job title, but the pay range for the job is $40,000 to $50,000, would we have to pay all of them overtime, even though some may make $50,000 while others make $40,000?
Well, you'll see in the next few minutes the fact that the limit now has been increased to $47,300 and something. So in that situation, if they make under those, if they're paid a salary and they're making under those levels, then you would have to pay. They're no longer exempt.
Mm-hmm. I think what he was asking is if they're doing the same job function and some are paid under the level and some are paid over the amount that would have them be exempt, should you pay all of them overtime? What are kind of your options?
No, only those. And again, you'll see this if they come under one of the exceptions: executive, administrative, or professional. And there are three tests. Remember, there's the primary duty, there's the matter of compensation, and then there's the actual compensation amount. And what I'm trying to say is they meet the first requirement. They meet the first requirement of being exempt.
Yeah.
And the primary duty is one of those three. The second is, how are they paid? Are they paid on a salary basis? And you see the next few minutes is the amount of the compensation. So you have to meet all three tests in order to be exempt. So again, if somebody meets two of the three, they're no longer exempt and they have to be paid overtime. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. And then the second question we had was, how do you handle inside salespeople who work off of base salary plus commission?
Well, in that situation, you would, again, they have to come under one of the exceptions, be paid a salary, and again, the amount of the salary has to be at a certain level. So again, you have to see if they come under one of the exemptions for white collar, and then if they're paid a salary, then that's the second, and then you have to look and see how much they're making.
All right, and then that was all we had in the question box. I'm going to open it up.
The conference has been unmuted.
Does anybody have any additional questions?
Air filters regularly. Keep windows and doors closed during pollen season. And
Hello?
remove mildew sources in your home.
I'm trying to find who's that.
Does anybody have any questions?
Manage your symptoms. Talk to a ProMedica physician today.
There we go.
Does anybody have any questions?
No, thank you.
Okay.
Alrighty then. Just give me a moment.
The conference has been muted.
Thing is, they have to be paid on a salary basis. So, just a second here. So here, the salary basis is a predetermined amount and not subject to a reduction because of variations in quality or quality of work. So here they're paid an amount, and it doesn't depend on the quality of work. It doesn't depend on how much they work. They're paid, and only under certain circumstances are their salary reduced. Here, there's only certain permitted deductions in salary. And these are, again, full-time absences, full-day absences to offset amounts such as jury duty, penalties imposed for good faith or violating safety rules. So only under certain conditions in this situation can that individual's salary be reduced. So again, for professional administrative can be here, permitted deductions of full-day disciplinary suspensions, proration in first or last week, or unpaid family and medical leave. So only under certain conditions can a salaried employee's salary be deducted. On a fee basis for professional administrative can be problematic when determining whether the amount is sufficient. And there's different rules for outside both in the manner and an amount that being paid. Now, here, the third category is the fact that under current rule, for a fee basis, for a salary basis, the current limits are $450 a week or $23,600 a year. For highly compensated, it is $100,000. So those are the current limits up to December of 2016. Those are the current limits. Now, if you don't meet those limits, what happens in the circumstances, employees must be paid overtime to white-collar employees who earn less than the required amount. So again, you have to meet all three tests in order to be considered to be exempt. And if an employee, if they're employed primarily in a white-collar position and are compensated on a salary basis that is less than the minimum that you saw there, then they must be paid overtime for any time over 40 hours. So under final changes in the exemption, what they did, they pegged minimum salary to that of the 40th percentile of the full-time workers, peg amount necessary to be highly compensated, annualized earnings at 90th percentile of the full-time employees. And for the first time, they put into place automatic increases. So what's troubling everybody, as you look at the slide right here, is the fact that minimum salary expected to be more than double to $913 a week, or $47,476. Those are the amounts. So in this situation, if you're paying a manager at a restaurant $45,000 a year, then what you must decide in that situation is, are you going to pay them overtime, or are you going to up their salary to that level in order for them to continue to be exempt? That's going to be the challenge. So again, you have to meet all three tests, and with the major differences and what's causing all kinds of angst, because you have to identify those employees that are going to be affected by this, and you have to make a decision: are you going to reduce their hours or increase their pay? Now, for highly compensated, the limit goes from $100,000 to $134,404. So here, as this slide indicates, the required compensation equivalence is somebody has to be paid $18.26 for biweekly, $1,978 to be paid semi-monthly, $3,956 are paid monthly. So this is what has to change starting in December of 2016. Now, employers will be able to use non-discretionary bonuses to up a person's salary, but you can only use any bonuses up to 10%, and that bonus has to be paid quarterly. So again, bonuses can be considered, but again, it must be paid quarterly. And for employers to credit non-discretionary bonuses and incentive pay towards a portion of the standard bonus, such payments will be paid on a quarterly basis. Now, for the first time, there's going to be updates. Automatic updates to both salary thresholds starting in 2020. And for example, the highly compensated, we're anticipating threshold is going to go up to $148,000 in 2020. So this is going to be an ongoing problem, and this is something that you have to plan for on an ongoing basis. Now here, the reason why they did this is the last increase was in 2014. Before that, it was in 1975. So again, this is something that the DOL looked at. There's a problem out there in regard to salary increases, and so this is going to be a real problem for some employers. Now, one of the concerns that people have in this situation is that these standard increases, and if you look at this, it's estimated, for example, for the white-collar exception, as this slide showed, and I didn't mention it before, it's going to be up to $51,000 in 2020. So again, this could be a real problem for certain employers. So it's estimated that 5 million workers are going to be eligible for overtime. I think that's underestimated. I think a lot more people are going to be affected by this. And here, the increase in salary threshold for an exempt employee will result in many employees who in the past were considered exempt now are going to be eligible for overtime. And this will result, as it says, for certain individuals to be paid overtime for any hours over 40. So how it's going to affect employers that all of a sudden now you have to start counting hours. These workers were, again, exempt. They didn't have to count hours, and now they have to do this. So this will, again, require the payment of counting hours and payment of overtime over 40 hours. Now, what's been suggested in this situation is that employers will have a number of different options that they have to go by. Now, if somebody is close to the limit, it's a no-brainer. The employer can raise salaries and keep the employee exempt for overtime. Or pay overtime in addition to the employee's current salary when necessary. Or what you may have to do is look at how many hours they're working and then evaluate and realign hours and staff workload. And say, well, I know you're working 55 hours a week and you're making X amount, but we can't afford to pay you overtime, so we're going to limit you to and we can't pay you overtime, so we're going to limit how many hours you basically are going to work. And there's going to be, in some situations, where you have to determine how to reclassify some employees as not exempt will affect their eligibility for certain employee benefits. And there's certain employers that have different benefits for certain types of employees. And in essence, what you're doing now is that you are turning some employees from being salary to hourly, and is that going to affect their eligibility for certain benefits? These are all things that I think an employer has to look at, and you have to look at your employee base to see who is going to be affected. So here, it's going to be important under these regulations to keep certain records to ensure that workers are paid wages that they earn and owed, because, again, the DOL will sue employers. And the employer has to choose the best way to, again, look at this. And for those individuals they have identified as being non-exempt because of the fact you don't meet the salary requirements, the best way to count their hours. And there's not a requirement under the regulations that employees punch in or punch out. But you do have to keep records, and the employee can keep records of how many hours they work during the day. And what you may want to do is each day have that person turn in their hours. So again, as this says, employers have flexibility in designing systems to make appropriate records and keep track of hours worked in each day. So again, you have to identify those employees that are no longer exempt. You have to set up a system by December 1st so you can count their hours. And you may want to, again, get a handle on this, is identify those employees that could be affected and see how many hours they work right now. Are there any questions? Amanda, do we have any questions?
We don't have any in the text right now. I'm going to unmute everybody so they can ask if they have any.
The conference has been unmuted.
Does anybody have any questions?
I have one for clarification. You said like the same job title, somebody makes, let's say I have two analysts, one makes $48,000 and one makes $42,000. So I would have to pay just the $42,000 analyst overtime, but not the $48,000 analyst?
Because remember, there's three tests.
Yes.
There's the duties test, there's a salary test, and then there's the amount of the salary test. So one individual meets all three limits.
Yes.
All three tests. So they're exempt. The other person does not.
Okay. And then for salespeople, like our salesperson would probably he makes over 50,000 total, but I mean he has like, let's say, a $25,000 base salary, plus his commissions, which normally add up to 30 to 40,000 annually. So how would that be?
Is he an outside or inside?
Inside.
Does it meet one of the exceptions for being administrator? I think he would meet one of the white-collar exceptions, correct?
Yes.
So in that situation, if he's making $50,000 a year, then he would be considered to be an exempt employee.
Okay, because his commissions
Correct.
can count towards that number. Okay.
But now you have in this situation, now you have 3 to 4 months to analyze your employees, identify those employees that are going to be affected, look what their duties are, look how they're being paid, and look at the amount of the compensation and then the first step you have to do is determine how many hours now are they working. And then basically what you have to do, you may have to give them an increase in salary, reduce their hours, but you have to start acting on this now.
Well, I mean, his W-2 wages over every year has been over 50, so I'm not worried there as long as his commissions count towards the...
Correct, but in general, I think you have to look at all your salaried employees.
Yeah, how close is the replacement to the original?
So, I mean, that's what you have to do. You have to look at all your employees, and those employees that are exempt, which employees are going to be affected by these new rules? And especially those that get a bonus, how is that going to be affected? And so, remember, you have to look at each 3 tests, look at the duties, and see exactly which of your employee groups are going to be affected.
Okay, perfect. And then for people that are way under, like, we can just pay them, they can still be salaried, but they would just be entitled to overtime.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. But again, you have to look at it, you have to advise them in that situation how it's going to affect their benefits. And especially if you have a 401k plan, you have to look at the definition of your definition of comp.
Ours includes overtime. I know that, so then that...
Well, I mean, what I'm saying, for those employees that currently are not getting overtime, now they are, their 401k contribution are going to be affected.
Correct.
Okay? Any other questions?
Yes, I have a question. We have 6 different unions, and I guess my first step is to identify everybody as exempt or non-exempt. And if they're non-exempt, and according to the union contracts, they get overtime, those are my non-issue people right off the bat.
Correct.
Then I look at all the non-union people, look at the level of their wages, and figure out if they are exempt or non-exempt.
Correct.
So when you talk about either raising somebody's salary or paying them overtime, you're talking about ones that are already presumed exempt employees.
Correct. And
Okay.
those, the only ones that are going to be affected by this, and again, it's the lower level of your exempt employees.
Right.
So though anybody making $55,000, $60,000, $65,000, just don't change.
If they're exempt.
If they're exempt, but in many industries, fast food, hotels, you have somebody that is under the white-collar exemption, because they're a manager. They manage 3, 4, or 5 people. But they're only making $35,000 or $40,000 a year. That's the individual that's going to be affected.
Right.
Okay? So if you have somebody who works in your office administratively, you pay them salary, but they only make $38,000 a year. So they come under the administrative exemption, but they're not making enough money. In that situation, that person is going to be affected.
Correct. Okay.
All right?
Thank you. Thank you.
Anybody else?
We had one more question that was typed in that asked what kind of effects these new rulings can have on benefit plans.
On what? I'm sorry, I didn't hear the end of that.
Sorry, they asked what kind of effects these new rulings could have on benefit plans.
Well, again, one of the biggest effects is going to be on 401k because, again, if you have an exempt employee that has a salary, in the past they were basing their election under the 401k plan of their salary. Well, now, if they have overtime, you have to look at the definition of comp in your 401k plan. So they were expecting that they're going to, let's say, they're going to make a 401k contribution of $5,000, but now they're going to be subject to overtime rules, and now their 401k contribution goes from $5,000 to $7,000. Well, they say, wait a minute, I don't want my 401k contribution to be that high, so they may have to reduce it. So you have to advise them what the effect is, especially in your 401k plan. Also, too, how does it affect your health and welfare plan? Do you differentiate your health and welfare plans between salaried and hourly? And will these individuals, under the definition of your hourly plan, will these people be newly eligible for different benefits? Because you differentiate, you say your hourly, your salaried, your hourly employees are those individuals that receive overtime. Well, all of a sudden, this salaried employee is now hourly. And many employers do that. They have different benefits between hourly and salaried people. You have to look at and see exactly how your benefit structure varies between salaried employees and hourly employees. But again, right now, use this time to analyze your employees and target those employees that are going to be affected. Any other questions? Anybody else?
Not right now, thank you.
Hopefully you found this helpful. Hopefully I didn't confuse too many of you. The next seminar in about, I think, 3 or 4 weeks is going to be on data breaches. And the reason why I'm having a seminar on this is because there's been a lot of issues in regard to employers being ready if somebody invades your territory, invades your computers, what do you do, and what your liability is. So we're going to talk about that legally, what you have to do.
That's going to be on
So again,
August
thank you
2nd.
very much. Hopefully you found this helpful, and I'll be talking to you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.